Hello, AM700. How's everybody's weekend going? I wanted to make this video to go over two of the articles that we have been assigned to read last week, to get us caught up and back on the right trajectory as far as the progression of our class goes. So today I'm going to be going over uh, both Herbert Blumer's race prejudice as a group position and Howard Winant's race and race theory article. Make this video at home and go over the articles briefly, and then you guys can email me with any questions or come into class with any questions you might have on them. But that way you don't have to throw them to the side, and we can keep kind of back on the right track. On Monday we can talk about the white by law reading, um, and then on Wednesday we can go over the implicit bias reading, and then we'll be right back on schedule where we should be at. So with that said, let's just jump straight into this first reading, the Herbert Blumer's Race Prejudice as a Sense of Group Position. In 1958. And when you're reading any of these articles, any scholarly articles in academia, a lot of them are structured similarly. They're all going to have, essentially, they'll have a lot of the same components. So you'll want to look for an argument first. You'll want to look for the state of the literature, which is the author talking about how other people in his discipline or how other people um, who have written about the same topic were approaching it prior to that author and their contribution to the study. So they'll say, okay, this is like how they're creating their in, why they're writing this art, what prompted them to write this, what was missing, what is the gap in the literature that they are filling in, or yeah, we're just what are they adding to the conversation, more or less. Um, and then you'll find just the goal, looking for the overall goal and the implications of findings at the end. Most times you can find all of this neatly wrapped up in abstract if the article has an abstract, but that's not always the case. Um, so this is a short and sweet article from Herbert Blumer. And in this article, he's talking about race prejudice. His argument that race prejudice generally stems from anxieties and understandings about one's position. We're all born into these various groupings and categorized via these different identities. And Herbert Blumer's argument is that the different uh, groups are in competition with each other, more or less. And this is where generally, for Herbert Blumer, um, he's finding that race prejudice stems from. So Blumer goes on to inform us that, a lot of the ways that people prior to him have been dealing with racial prejudice and analyzing racial prejudice have been looking at racism between individuals and prejudice between individuals. So whether it's one person not liking all individuals in another group, or one person stereotyping another group, one person you know, using a racial slur, there's all these different ways where race prejudice was analyzed on the individual scale and seen as just a relationship between people. But he wants to get away from that and focus more on race in the structural or the macro. Um, so that's why group positioning idea is helpful. So Blumer gets us away from feelings or away from only focusing on feelings and focuses on systems and unconscious bias. It allows us to think about how race prejudiced individuals think of themselves as belonging to a specific racial group. And race prejudice is made up of how one perceives oneself and one's race and one's understanding of their race's position within the larger social, economic, political hierarchy of any given society. So, although he's trying to, move away from feelings, from such great emphasis on feelings, Bloomer begins by discussing feelings associated with racial prejudice, but he connects those feelings to the macro uh, structural racial grouping and the ideas tied to those groupings. So he says that the superior group has this idea of superiority and connected to morality and merit. So they perceive people as their group as more moral and more worthy, more qualified. They're entitled. They feel entitled to jobs and housing, access to public spaces, public services, and they feel they have exclusive membership. So number two is distinctiveness or exclusive access to public spaces. They feel propriety or like they're proper and respectable and civil. We see the same, concepts come up, especially early on in the formation of the Americas and the colonization of the Americas. And then number four, so you have one superiority, two distinctiveness, three propriety, and then four was inferiority, right? So they perceive the people of the subordinate racial group um, that they have othered as lazy, immoral, unintelligent. They feel they want to exclude them, alienate them. They're beyond proper, and they're abject, right? They're othered. Um, So just quoting Blumer for the next few lines, he says, this sense of group position overdetermines the relation between the dominant and the subordinate group. So it's overdetermined. What does he mean by that term? He means there's a multiplicity of different factors that go into defining this relationship, or it could potentially define how these groups relate to one another. You only really need one of these four, categories to create this sense of superiority, this racial prejudice between groups, this hostility between groups of different um, groups within a given society, uh, positioned on a different level. Uh, and, but you have all of these coming into play. So all you really need is one, but you have multiple, and this is what the overdetermined concept refers to. They're overdetermined. Uh, Overdetermines the relationship between the dominant group and the subordinate group, the sense of group position. So group position transcends the individual feelings of the dominant group, giving such members a common orientation that is not otherwise found in separate feelings and attitudes. So these people may not agree with each other, politically on any other thing. They you may question them individually, and they don't necessarily express the racial prejudice. But uh, when they go back into society, their actions, their feelings, their attitudes can sometimes, imply that they are even intuitively, unconsciously grappling with their position on the social hierarchy. Um, so the feeling of disposition is generally a feeling not reducible to specific feelings of hate or any sort of prejudice. It is a sense of what ought to be more than what is. It is a sense of where the two racial groupings belong within society. On page five, Blumer says, to the extent they recognize or feel themselves as belonging to that group, they will automatically come under the influence of the sense of position held by that group. So, whether they, are aware of that or not is irrelevant for Blumer. Race prejudice exists to protect the position of the dominant group. So group positions overshadow class distinctions. So thus members of the dominant group, whether high or low status, upper class, middle class, lower class, share the same group orientation. Um, this attitude is set historically within the context of the first contact between these groups. So, as I was just saying a minute ago, you can trace a lot of this back to colonialism, enslavement, and these attitudes that are produced in that moment uh, really define how these groups are going to relate to one another. So factors such as prestige, power, skill, numbers, self-conceptions, aims, designs, and opportunities, all of these uh, factors that went into play during that first encounter, uh, we see them informing the relationship between the groups into the modern era. So Newport Boomer's writing this in 1958. So formed through an ongoing process in which the dominant racial group continuously defines and redefines the subordinate racial group and the relations between them. So the subordinate group can't even define themselves because the dominant group controls, all the ways, all the information that we intake. They control the media, and that's one of the ways that these images, feelings, and attitudes uh, get passed along and spread. And Blumer goes into that. Says the collective images and feelings attached to racial prejudice are forged out of a social process in which the groups are shaped and organized, defined through complex interaction and communication through and by leaders, legal authorities, media, educators. All these people are responsible with relaying these messages. Subordinate racial groups are defined by an abstract image of the group, as if it were an entity or a whole or a monolith. So before you're even able to express yourself as an individual, you are being read by stereotypes that people have of your group that don't come from your group. They're coming from the dominant group that controls the information we intake. So people with subordinate racial groups are not treated as individuals. The collective image the dominant group holds of the subordinate group over determines that where it comes up again, the interaction with individuals of the group. So again, you can't even express yourself uh, before people start reading these stereotypes onto you. You can't express your morality, express your hard work, express your individuality before you're being read over by these stereotypes, before you even interact with someone of a different social grouping. So what are the implications? Blumer breaks down some of the implications. He says images of the group are formed not in interactions with individuals of the group, but through transcending characterizations of popular stereotypes, big events. The media would refer to this as media studies would refer to this as racial spectacles. Ones that awaken feelings of identification form these understandings. Uh, also, those who appear to have power and the attention of the public, celebrities, media, intellectuals, and authorities, again, have the most influence on our understanding of racial group positions. Powerful special interest groups and political groups also play a role in defining these racial groups. Racial prejudice then becomes entrenched and tenacious to the extent that the prevailing social order is rooted in the sense of social position. So he concludes with the idea that once these racial spectacles are not treated as such defining moments and so divisively by leaders, then feelings of group positionings would begin to dissipate. I don't know if I agree with that. Take that or leave that. But I think overall, this article does a lot to help us understand how prejudice doesn't isn't only taking place on the individual scale, it's taking place on a macro level, but it's also not always something people are conscious of. They're doing it intuitively, and I think it speaks to the implicit bias readings that we'll go over next week as well. So this article it seemed to in my last semester when I taught this course come up and again people relating it to other articles. So I think it's short and it's good. It does a lot. It's very informative in a short amount of time. So with all that said, now we can turn to the Howard and Whatnot reading. So let's do that. Okay. So boom, Howard Whatnot is writing to us, almost 42 years later in the year 2000. And he is a sociologist. So he does this sociological study of race and what he calls race theory. And he's pretty much saying, listen, the study of race in sociology has hit a wall. So this is his state of the literature right here. He's like, we are stagnant. We are not doing anything with this research today. And he breaks down why. He makes it pretty clear. He says, since its inception, sociology has worked to address race and racism. And it's done a great job to that extent. There's been significant progress made. Um, he points to development uh, devoid as far as making sociology more scientific and meticulous, careful in its research. He points to another moment during the revolutions in Africa and the civil rights movement and the Cold War, and how sociology has been influenced by global politics and race as it relates to global politics. Um, but the racial injustices of the past have not been fully overcome. Sociology has not been able to answer that question, has not been able to fix this issue within our society. And he argues that it's in desperate need of a new racial theory. So, to tackle race and racism in the new millennia, he argues sociology must develop these new racial theories that is more effective, that is even more meticulous. Um, it has to be formulating a more adequate historical sociology of race. So, looking at how race is formed through social interaction. Um, Understanding how micro and macro linkages that shape racial issues. So again, kind of connecting back to Bloomers in this sense, not only looking at the micro race relations, but looking how it connects to the macro, and also looking at global politics, I think, and how that influences race relations and ideas about race. And then finally, the recognition of pervasive racial politics in contemporary society. So, recognizing there's this push towards colorblindness that is not really the reality. And how race still plays a role in politics today in contemporary society, even though there's this growing push for colorblindness or for being post-racist, if you will. So went on he says he's going to attempt to survey the theoretical dimensions of race today. And he begins with, he breaks actually the uh, state of literature down a little more. Um, it says sociology's understanding of race and racial formation needs an overhaul. After advances in the early 20th century, the field of sociology has stagnated, as I said. It's divided and confused over racial theory. So there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of disagreement, and therefore people are anxious about formulating new theories and opinions. Some of the difficulties are the oversaturation of research. There's so much research that has been done in this field, and you need to go back and read all the defining articles and books within the field of sociology as it regards race, and even other some other social issues that connect to race in order to even approach this conversation. So your approach needs to be historical and contemporary and empirical. It needs to have data and theoretical. So it needs to show the data and connect that data to theory, to ideas that are beyond just numbers. So the historical and political, macro and micro and analysis. So new racial theory needs to cover a lot of bases. So it's kind of almost overwhelming for people to approach this subject, especially to uh, doing something new, especially when there's so much information that needs to be read before you can even begin to have the discussion, let alone say you're contributing something new to the discussion. So this is the topics we're running into. And we're not going to be introducing something new into the discussion at the end of this paper. So we'll get there. But first, he wants to break his article up into four different categories. So he says first he wants to explore the origins of race, the concept of race. Sorry, explore the sociological study of race, how it's shaped by large scale politics, and look at some of the issues with contemporary approaches to the race concept and its limitations. And then he puts some notes towards the new racial theory. He doesn't, map out the entire thing in this article, but in the last section, he says this is the way that we could approach this in the future. But first, he looks at the origins of this race concept. And he says the race, though prefigured in early ages, only took on its present range of meanings within the uh, foundation of modernity. So race didn't really have the same meaning until more recently in the rise of modernity. The deep interconnection between the development of the modern world system of capitalism, seaborne empire, slavery, and the exfoliation of a worldwide process of racialization is not in doubt. Um, so the concept of race is prefigured by ethnocentrism and ancient concepts like civilization, civility, and barbarity, citizen, outside, slave. All these things kind of were the foundational to creating this concept of race. They were precursors to race. Um, you can see how those ideas have grown to be part of what we think of now as race and racial difference. So he points to like the Crusades, the Inquisition, the Mediterranean uh, slave trade were important precursors to the development of the concept of race, but it did not take on its full meaning until the end of the Middle Ages. So, and then he gives us a definition for race. He says race as a concept that signifies and symbolizes social political conflict and interest in reference to different types of human bodies. Race signifies biology, however, the production of racial signification varies based on social and historical context. So when we think of race, we think of it as being biological, but it's really about the production of racial signification based on social and historical context, political as well. So the idea of race began to officially take shape with the birth of a global political economy, with the emergence of the merchant class and capitalism, colonialism, enslavement. This is really the heyday of race. This is when race comes to have its fullest meaning. Like I said, there were precursors. People noticed difference between different groups of people. Um, they noticed color differences, but there wasn't this really concept of race or being different biologically natured individuals until this time, when it became beneficial to formulate these, to place different groups of people into these separate categories. So some key factors in the development of race, one of the states is the global economic integration, seaborne empires, conquest of the Americas, and colonialism, and the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. So racial categorization, he says, was a European invention, an outcome of the same world historical process that birthed European nation states and empires. So it's an outcome of this different, nationalism that was growing within European nations, and also colonialism, a combination of the two, uh, incentivized the creation of races. And it was explained by Enlightenment rationality. So, these enlightenment thinkers that we place on these pedestals, a lot of them were responsible for developing these categorizations of people. Um, this is not to say that the European attainment of imperial and world encompassing power gave rise to race. Indeed, it is just as easy to argue that the opposite, that the modern concept of race gave rise to, or at least facilitated the creation of an integrated social political world, a modem authoritarian state, the structures of an international economy, and the emergence over time of a global culture. We must recognize these issues as deeply racialized matters. So it's not to say the European attainment of imperial and world encompassing power gave rise to race. Indeed, it's just as easy to argue the opposite, that the modern concept of race gave rise to all that power. So they're both kind of feeding into one another and growing one another. And actually, in this video down here that I was going to have us watch is Professor Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She talks about race uh, and its origins in European society, and how Irish people were in a sense racialized by people in Britain, and kind of a lot of their treatment, mirrored the way uh, subordinate racial groups are treated later on, and even in the modern era. So race really has its precursors in European society itself. So in this section on how the sociological study of race is shaped by large scale politics, when I backtrack to look at the foundational text, the classical sociological text, and how they formulated to elucidate the emergence of Europe in the modern era. Um, so we looked at Herbert Spencer, who is thought of as the Euro sociologist, like the first sociologist, the father of sociology, and how it reads like a biological determinant focused on evolution and ranking groups to their natural order. So really treating race as if it is biological, and all these groups, racial groups, based on their biology, with whites on the top and non-whites forming somewhere below them and blacks on the bottom for the most part. And then, so after that, you have Karl Marx. There's another, foundational sociological type, a classic, in Capital, and he denounced the European plunder of the non-European world. So he's a little bit more progressive in that sense. Capital accumulation related back to, capital accumulation. But his idea is that ethnic cleansing would ultimately come to benefit the survivors of colonialism, so the people that survived in would benefit from becoming part of this greater European society. Uh, so there's a tendency towards Eurocentrism there. Um, but even Marx, he had, in one of his writings, he talked about anti-blackness in North America, at least. He didn't speak on race and racism too much, on anti-blackness too much, but he did have a few things to say about it. And he had said that, the rise of the proletariat, the poor class, could never happen in the Americas while blacks are still insane. Uh, misquoting it is similar to that. That's not a direct quote, but that was more or less what his wording on the issue was. But definitely should have looked into it more and had more to say about it, I'm sure. And then when I also looked at Max Weber, who recognized anti-blackness in the U.S., but also fell victim to European chauvinism at times in his writing. So all these foundational classic sociological texts it, it, highlights sociological thought emerged in an imperious, Eurocentric, and indeed racist era. And he moves on. So a few hundred years later, um, looks at the 20th century and how American perspectives of race were still biological. So we had Jim Crow, apartheid, and colonialism. Um, Colonialism ended allegedly, but we still see that there was remnants of that still going on. African slavery was still in living memory. The country had just recently been closed. There was debates over immigration, over imperialism, uh, regarding the Spanish American War in the Philippines. Uh, Race was perceived as natural, obvious, unchangeable, and a vital feature of the subject mind, body, and soul. An excuse, defense of African slavery, and a critique of abolitionism. So indigenous Americans, Mexicans, Spanish, and Asian Holocaust were viewed as crucial for human progress within the study of sociology at this time. Yet this period also marked a vital transformation in essential views on race. You had World War II and international politics denouncing uh, colonialism to some degree, and denouncing the Holocaust of the Jews. Labor demands increased and democracy became more important nationally and globally. There's anti-colonial movements, the civil rights movement, all these things taking place around the same era. Democratic demands of countries previously considered backward and uncivilized, uh, colonialized societies were finding their strength and kicking out their colonizers often, or demanding for their own autonomy, self-government. There was increased agency of American blacks after World War One, and they gained factory jobs, they gained better jobs. Some of them got GI Bills where they were able to use that for an education, but as we'll see later in the semester, uh, they were blocked from using that GI Bill often to buy a house. But all this motivated slow advances toward a redefined approach to sociology of race. And then we see that um, come to manifest in the work of W. Du Bois with the Philadelphia Negro, where he sought to correct previous European studies done on African American communities that were tainted by stereotypes and implicit bias. Du Bois's work is backed with empirical data, so it seems objective in that sense. It's hard to argue against. Um, by the greater European which relies heavily on data, and they put forth a strong argument for the benefits of democratization of race relations. So to give Black people equal footing, to give them civil rights and equal participation in this democracy. His concepts of the veil and racial dualism were also, significant for the study of sociology and pushing it forward. There was the Chicago School of Sociology Studies, who basically did the same thing Du Bois did, focusing on racial dimensions on a macro level, uh, the benefits of democratization, focused on crime and poverty. So looking really at the empirical data, the same way Du Bois did, but because it was, this predominantly white school, it was just one single Black male doing the study. I think it really pushed um, the narrative forward in academia and in the study of sociology. At scattered biological assumptions about race, unshakably stating that race is socially constructed and not uh, necessarily real, although it has real social implications, political implications, economic implications on your life success. But it's not something that is uh, can be so easily explained through biology, or people can't be categorized. And then he goes on to critique the contemporary approaches to race. I want to just pause really quickly and say I'm sorry that there's so much information on these slides. What normally happens is we're in class and I'm able to look at one thing at a time and use my little clickies. The animation pop up one at a time, one line at a time. Luxury here while using this video recorder. So we see everything at once and it's kind of a lot to look at. But again, these PowerPoints will be uploaded to Canvas and you'll have access to them so you can return to them. You don't have to pause the video and try to read everything really quickly and take notes on everything. You'll have access to it. But anyway, in this section where Winant looks at contemporary approaches to race and critiques them, he shows first how, again, in the 20th century and prior to that, social political concerns and pressures drove the theory of sociology forward. So anthropology switched from looking at physical traits to more cultural traits. Again, fascism, Nazism became associated with eugenics. So there's a decrease in scientific racism. It wasn't so popular to, frame other groups of people, racialized groups of people as lesser than within European society. Uh, Communism upsurged, so Marxist accounts of race became increasingly popular. There's an uptick in Black social, political, and cultural movements, and then great uh, migration taking place uh, within former colonies and within America, all pushing the theory forward. But we're not having some critiques for these theories that have been developed because there was a tendency towards reductionism with these post-war racial theories. Uh, there was three categories that he breaks them into, three types of racial theories that developed around this time: ethnicity-based ones, that started race as culturally grounded; class-based theories that started race as a group stratification related to economics and competition; and nation-based theories that thought of race as geopolitical terms connected to the land, peoplehood, or race unity. So all these theories were reductionist. They tended to only look at this one through this one lens. Whereas obviously, when Kant is arguing that we need a multiplicity of lenses to be able to analyze race as it manifests today in the new millennium. analyze race and racism. And then he also, you know, criticizes liberal progressive reforms. He says they mask racial injustices rather than eliminating them. They hid them, made them harder to fight, and slowly erased radical revolutionary frameworks and movements. Because you had these little uh, reforms that took place that, he was, oh, I got this much and I don't want to complain and lose little I got. So they didn't fight as hard to keep pushing on going forward. There wasn't as much fire within these movements as there had been prior. So movements that repressed people became passive and lost steam due to these mostly symbolic gestures and reforms. So they didn't really fix anything structurally. Maybe a few people got ahead, or maybe there was more representation, but nothing really changed on a fundamental level for a lot of these groups. I mean, civil rights were wonderful, but you also needed the enforcement of these civil rights. And as we'll see later on in the semester, and as some of us maybe already know, that enforcement did not always take place, and it was not expedient. Even when we did desegregate schools, it said with all, I forget the exact framing of the law, but with all deliberate speed, I think is the term that they use, the phrase, sorry. And obviously, different states, different school systems interpreted this how they wanted to. So people really drag their feet in certain areas, and as far as desegregating their school system, they took their time because it was all deliberate speed and really abstract. And they interpreted that however was most beneficial to whatever they desired, which was mostly to remain segregated. So by the end of the century, we are left with unresolved racial dilemmas. And more contemporary racial approaches, the persistence of race-based distinctions, so reforms did not end racism overtly, covertly, individually, or systemically. They just masked the issue, as I was saying. Many thought the age of multiculturalism would lead to colorblindness and ethnic pluralism, but it made the case that this new formation provided the perfect cover for continuing racism. So it's just a way to mask the reality. And then he breaks down further the ethnicity-based theories and the issues that he had with that, class-based theories, same thing, and later projectionist and nation-based theories. And we'll move on and talk about his notes towards a new racial theory and how he wants to approach the sociology of race, the study of race and racism in the modern era. So he presents the situation. We are post-colonial, post-segregationist, uh, racial heterogeneity, so there's racial diversity throughout the world. Um, but race still plays a role in social outcomes. Any new theory produced will continue to be a product of its time, he says, and racial identity is still used, and it's important to do that. So we need to take all of these things into account before we even begin to approach this study and formulating new theories. So what does a new racial theory require, he says? The conventional racial theory must address the persistent racial stratification despite the mass of voices calling for racial equality, despite multiculturalism, and despite the knowledge of social historic roots of race, and that it's not real biological, but it has social. So we need to address all these things and how race is still a persistent within our society, racism. We must address the newly pervasive forms of politics or racially conscious conception of action or agency, identity politics, and also uh, must be interdisciplinary. So we need to look at the dimensions of race. We need to look at empirical data. We need to look at the micro, macro linkages um, central to racial dynamics. And, um, everything that we mentioned early on needs to be a study of history, a study of contemporary moment, a study of how those are linked together, a study of individual racism with structural racism and how that is linked together and multidisciplinary. So, is raising racial formation theory is new theory that he wants to put forward, or begin to put forward here in the end. And he says racial formation theory views the meaning of race and the content of racial identities as unstable and politically contested. Race is always changing. We've seen that in some of the videos that we had watched in our first meeting, where race was changing based on your geography, where you were located in the world, and based on your historical moment. It understands racial formation as the intersection, conflict of racial projects that combine racial representation, discursive elements within the structural and institutional ones. It sees these intersections as iterative articulations of the meaning of race and are open to many types of agency, from individual to organizational, from the local to the group. Not only is race changing as far as like uh, how you're legally defined, but whatever authority is able to define what race you are in that moment can alter. The race is forever changing based on the authority that are given the power to define the limitations of race in whatever organization space you're in. Like that for a second, sorry guys. Across the world, we still live in the afterlife of slavery, colonialism, apartheid, and segregation. The legacies of centuries of racial oppression have not been overcome. Today, racial differences often operate as a way of restricting the political influence, not just of racially subordinated groups, but also all those at the bottom end of the system of social stratification. So even people who are in the dominant racial order are also, impacted negatively by racial prejudice, racial, like, I guess, policies that hurt people of a certain race, but they end up hurting everybody of the poor class at the end of the day. So the hegemonic effects of decades of reform-oriented state racial policies have removed much of the motivation for sustained anti-racist mobilization. So those liberal or aggressive reforms have, worked to pacify social movement in this country. Colorblindness will remove the effects this history has had on our lives and social structure. Will not remove the effects this history has had on our lives and social structure. And like religion or language, race can be accepted as part spectrum of the human condition, while it is simultaneously and like, categorically resisted as a means of stratifying national or global society. So we can, appreciate the different cultural, uh, different cultural aspects to people's race, that we have come to associate with people's race, while also, recognizing the racial through systemic and the ways that race comes to define people's social So that's really, I think, everything we can take away from this article. Um, I had a whole video of how it would not, if you can hear on the right, and there's another theorist who led, that he wrote a different article with that is related to this. His name is his last name. I can't remember his first name, but basically doing the same thing. So I wanted us to watch this in class. I wanted us to do a Latin class there. Unfortunately, we're not able to get to, but hopefully this video helps us to get back on track, and hopefully it helps you to understand the reading a little more, and then we can look at white by law and have a really fun group discussion on that on Monday. And I'll see you guys then. Take care.